China's government. Time now for my political panel. Liberal Senator Concetta Fierravanti-Wells and Shadow Minister for Multicultural Affairs Andrew Giles. They both join me. Welcome to both of you.
Great to be with you.
Concetta, I do want to start with you and on this issue around China. China's government has announced it's indefinitely suspending all activities under the China-Australia Strategic Economic Dialogue. Do you view that as retaliation for ripping up the Belt and Road Initiative?
Look, Patricia, this is not surprising. This dialogue was established in 2014 and there haven't been, I think the last contact or meetings pursuant to this dialogue were in 2017. So it doesn't surprise me that this has happened, and I think that post-COVID, certainly it cannot be business as usual with the communist regime in China. And I think that what we're really seeing is the Leviathan ship of state is slowly turning in relation to China, but it still has a way to go before we re-establish and decouple, I think, from China and reduce our dependency on the communist regime.
Should the federal government, Senator, cancel the 2011 trade and investment agreement China struck with WA, given they cancelled Victoria's Belt and Road deal?
Look, I've had some comments about this over in the last day or so. I think that the agreement should be cancelled, bearing in mind that the bulk of that agreement referred to potential arrangements between the Western Australian government and private companies. And as we know, there is no real difference between Chinese state-owned enterprises and private companies in China. And that's really where a lot of the so-called arrangements are of concern that we've had and do need scrutiny. But of course, our foreign relations legislation doesn't deal with arrangements with private companies, and of course that's the reason why we can't take back the Port of Darwin pursuant to that legislation.
Andrew Giles, this cancellation by China, obviously it's an escalation of that very frosty relationship. What should we read into it?
Well, it's both concerning and disappointing, but I think the questions for Australia are really how do we effectively articulate and advance our national interests and our values in the face of a more assertive China? And how we do that requires, frankly, a bit more consideration than has been shown, and perhaps also attention to detail when it comes to language, as Penny Wong made clear earlier today, than has been demonstrated by the Prime Minister.
On India, Concetta Fierravanti-Wells, are you comfortable with this ban of our citizens?
Well, Patricia, I am troubled by this, particularly the point that it is illegal for Australian citizens to come home. But I'm particularly troubled as a consequence of the work that has been done by the committee that I chair, and that is the Senate Standing Committee on the Scrutiny of Delegated Legislation. And we've done a lot of work, in particular in relation to the use of delegated legislation, which is not subject to scrutiny of the Parliament. And as part of the work that we did on the interim, in our interim report, we actually looked at the Biosecurity Act. We looked at the provisions of Section 477, pursuant to which this determination was made, and we recommended that determinations and directions that are made under the Biosecurity Act should be subject to disallowance and consequently should be subject to the scrutiny of our Parliament.
So you say you're troubled by it. Should the government bring these Australian citizens home on chartered special flights as soon as possible before May 15th?
Look, I think that we are certainly not undertaking the similar procedures that the US and the UK are doing. As I said, my concerns about this is that there was an order signed by the Governor-General back on the 18th of March last year. Now, that order declaring a pandemic has been rolled over in 3 monthly periods since then, and there has been no opportunity for the Parliament to scrutinise that determination or indeed matters that were made or directions that were made pursuant to that. And that includes things like travel bans. It includes restrictions on where people can and can't go in Australia. And so I think it's important for the primacy of the Parliament to prevail here and to ensure that these sort of determinations are examined and examined by the Parliament. Now, I can appreciate that in times of emergency that, and our committee specifically looked at this, in times of emergency, these determinations are important to be made as part of that emergency. However, to now leave it so many months and a year and a half later and not have afforded our Parliament the opportunity to examine these determinations, I think is surrendering the primacy of our Parliament. And as I've said, when you do have Senator Kim Carr, myself, the IPA, and Professors Williams and Toomey on the same page on an issue, then you do understand that there is a concern.
Just briefly, do you want this revisited by the Parliament next, I mean, obviously next week's budget week, but is this sort of something you're pushing inside your own party as an immediate thing you should do?
Well, we now have a motion. The committee that I chair now has a motion before the Senate, and that motion calls for giving effect to various recommendations, and that includes potentially a change to our standing orders to enable instruments that currently are not disallowable by the Parliament to be reviewed. Indeed, we've actually made a recommendation, as I indicated earlier, in relation to the Biosecurity Act.
Andrew, do you think this India travel ban is a racist measure, like some people in the Indian Australian community say?
Well, what I think is much less important than what Indian Australians think, and clearly many do, and many have said so to me. But our challenge is to deal with that issue by acting, and that's what's so deeply frustrating here. We are watching an extraordinary humanitarian crisis unfold in India with, I think, 21 million people currently affected by COVID, and there are 9,000 Australians there who've just been given an awful message, 900 of them vulnerable. These are people who hold Australian passports and deserve the promise of that passport to be honoured, not to be subject to threats. And Patricia, I think it is impossible to understate the sense of anxiety and frustration that so many people in the Indian Australian community have expressed to me and to others, people who feel that their citizenship isn't quite as valuable as others. That just can't continue in Australia in 2021.
If I can bring you back in, Senator, you mentioned being troubled by this India ban. Clearly many people in the Indian Australian community see it as racist. You mentioned the double standard UK, US. Do you understand why they see it as racist?
I understand that there are real concerns in relation to this, but I think, Patricia, we need to step back and look at the broader issue here, and that is that this matter is now being raised with the federal court, and it will be interesting to see what the federal court does in relation to this. And given that the legal proceedings are on foot, it wouldn't be appropriate to discuss that. But I do go back to the point that I made earlier, and that is that there have been many determinations that have been made pursuant to the Biosecurity Act across a whole range of different areas. And I think the fact that as a Parliament we haven't had the opportunity to scrutinise and, if required, veto those determinations, I think it is really of real concern.
And you agree with that, Andrew?
Well, look, I think Concetta raises important questions about how our democracy should operate, but there's an urgent question for the Morrison government now, which is to get stranded Australians home, and beyond that, to do the other things that they could and should have done so long ago, to put in place the quarantine arrangements that work, and, you know, while we're at it, to actually manage a vaccination rollout that will enable us to manage our borders and our engagement with the world into the future.
Thank you to both of you. It's been a really good conversation. Appreciate your time.
Thanks, Patricia.
Thanks, Patricia.
Liberal Senator Concetta Fierravanti-Wells and the Shadow Minister for Multicultural Affairs, Andrew Giles.